In our last lesson, we looked at reducing orchestral scores for piano. Our first examples came from Mozart. In the later 19th century, orchestras became larger and orchestration got richer. In particular, Wagner's orchestration explored new paths that would have been impossible in Mozart's time. In Richard Strauss's version of the Berlioz Orchestration Treatise, he mentions that virtually all of his additions to the original are from Wagner. When he discusses Wagner's approach to orchestration, he says, "There are three technical points which should be stressed, of course with reasonable reservations, for they are the basis for the perfection of Wagner's ideas in the modern orchestra. First, the employment of the richest polyphonic style. Second, the accomplishment of this through the invention and introduction of the valve horn. Third, taking over the virtuoso technique of the solo concerto for all instruments of the orchestra." The point which concerns us here is the first one, a more polyphonic approach to orchestration. Even a cursory glance at Wagner's mature scores reveals that the secondary parts have a kind of contrapuntal richness not normally found in earlier orchestral works. And this is not limited to contrapuntal forms, it's a general feature of his style. This, however, makes for more difficulties when reducing these scores. In a simple homophonic texture, as long as the main, usually the outer parts, are preserved, the details of spacing in the inner parts can be changed without being noticed. But the more contrapuntal the texture, the more attention will be focused at times on the inner parts. One obvious solution to this problem is to make the reductions for more than one player, for example piano four hands. And indeed, many such works exist in this form. But for our purposes, the two-hand reductions are of more interest since they force the arranger to compromise more often, and that leads to fascinating questions about the composer's intentions in the original orchestral version. Let's take the overture to Wagner's Meistersinger as an example. Although not explicitly a contrapuntal piece, there are many degrees of contrapuntal interest here. For example, at the beginning of the movement, the bass and the top line are fairly independent. However, in measure 3, they're in the same rhythm and make up a simple homophonic texture. Even when the outer parts are more independent, as in the preceding and following bars, the middle parts usually follow the rhythm of one of the outer parts, so reducing the whole isn't too difficult. We just have to rearrange the spacing to fit in the two hands. Where things start to get complex is around measure 15. If we look, for example, at the violas and the second violins in this passage, they become rhythmically more independent, contributing more contrapuntal interest. It's impossible to play all the string parts here on the piano at the same time. Even without the double bass part, there are several places where the pianist simply couldn't stretch widely enough to play everything, or where trills would make the whole just too awkward. Let's look at how the reduction handles these problems. There are two issues to deal with here. First, the middle parts add motion, eighth notes and trills. Second, they sometimes enrich the harmony with dissonances. As for the motion, the trills are simply not practical while playing all the other parts, so the reduction has to eliminate them. In a few places, like the first beat of measure 18, the eighth note adds a bit more momentum. Klindworth has nevertheless chosen not to include it, probably because the note is already present in the right hand and the repeated D would stick out. However, the E, F sharp on the second and third beats are important, so he transposes them up into the middle of the right hand. On the last beat, if he'd done the same thing, the E, F sharp would have had to be repeated, since they aren't playable in their original registers. But again, repeated notes would stick out as a different motive nowhere present in Wagner's original. So Klindworth makes a compromise and only keeps the descending line, F sharp E. On the second beat of measure 19, it would have been possible to include the passing note B between the C and the A in the middle of the right hand, but since the bass already has a B, the harmony is not incomplete. So we can see that when the middle parts are more contrapuntal, the decisions about what to keep and what to ignore get more complicated. You need to understand the role of each note in the middle parts. Now, if measure 3 was totally homophonic, this passage is somewhat more contrapuntal, but the coming bars are even more so. In measure 27 and 8, the second violin is chromatic. In cases like this, where the chromatic notes strongly color the harmony, they can sound like wrong notes if the stepwise movement isn't preserved. So here Klindworth preserves the chromatic line as is. This is made possible by his decision not to include the lower octave of the melody in the clarinet. He does leave out a few diatonic notes in the viola and cello parts, maintains the melody, the bass, and the chromatic line from the second violin. However, there are situations where it's simply impossible to represent all the parts at the same time on the keyboard. Here's an example from the first movement in Mozart's quartet K387. The cello line here is gradually moving down. The second violin makes thirds and sixths below the top line, but the viola doubles the cello in parallel tenths and 16th notes. Then in the next bar, all three upper instruments rise up together with a scale to the peak of the phrase, the high D. It's interesting to notice, once again, that this is not an explicitly contrapuntal texture like a fugue. The string quartets very often include situations like this, since a quartet is normally conceived as a conversation between four equal members. Given the wide ranges of the string instruments, they often cross or else include multiple distant registers at the same time, making it impossible to play the piano. Here's how a transcription of the above passage is realized by Krelle. As we can see, the texture has to be simplified. The 16th note doublings above the cello and below the first violin have disappeared. One might think that the doubling in tenths above the cello could have been transposed down an octave, making double thirds for the piano. But that would be virtuoso figuration, not at all like the simple flowing scales in the strings. And at the required tempo, they are very difficult to play. Now let's look at a different kind of texture that requires a fair amount of rearranging. This is from the beginning of the third act of Wagner's Die Walküre. If we look at the orchestral version, we see many different elements overlapping with each other. First, there's the galloping motive in the bassoons, horns, and cellos. This is the foreground, and it has to be preserved intact. Then there are the entrances of a little scale motive, leading to notated trills in the upper woodwinds. There's one such entry on the pickup to each beat of bar 9. These scalar upbeats are reinforced by string doublings. Finally, as the trills, doubled in 3 octaves, continue in the woodwind, the other strings have cascading arpeggios. Obviously, no pianist can play all this at the same time. What's important to understand here is that this is not, in any sense, counterpoint. These upbeat scales, trills, and cascading arpeggios all combine to form a texture, meant to suggest the tremendous energy of the Valkyrie on their horses. So rather than try and combine all these ideas simultaneously, the piano needs some kind of energetic figuration that's reasonably easy to play and that can suggest the overall effect. Let's see how Klindworth solved this problem. As expected, the low galloping motive is intact. In the right hand, however, the figuration combines bits of scale, trill, and arpeggio successively rather than simultaneously. This creates a reasonable amount of energy without requiring the pianist to have 5 hands. Obviously, there are several other possibilities along the same lines which could work equally well, but all involve a lot of compromise. And that is really the point of this lesson. To make the reductions work, you have to understand the role and the importance of each element in the original. So a piano reduction is a good test of whether you really understand the orchestration. Just as with transcriptions from piano to orchestra, the solution should sound idiomatic and appropriate. Note-by-note thinking is like trying to translate word for word between languages. It's awkward at best and nonsensical at worst.